the Environmental Justice Foundation, who made the video there. There's a lot of their literature at the back, and in what I'm going to say about climate refugees and migration and so on today, there's quite a lot of facts and figures, and you don't need to remember them. You can look them up in the really excellent pamphlets and so on. But just as Kyle has said, that we face an existential environmental threat to humanity from climate change, and indeed with the associated and linked other environmental crises that are about the crisis of biodiversity, ocean acidification, and so on. But what I really want to talk about today is the impact that means upon people and how those people, when they try and flee, are treated and so on. And the first thing to say is that the environmental crisis and the refugee movements that are caused by that are on a scale that is utterly unprecedented in human history. And it's a scale that's going to get even bigger. Just to give you one sense of how big things could be and how bad things could be, how quickly, if you like, 40% of humans alive in the world today live within less than 100 kilometres from the sea. With expected sea level rises, that will mean large numbers of those people will have to leave. They'll have to leave because their homes are no longer viable, their villages, their towns, their cities are going to be destroyed. They'll have to leave perhaps because their work is no longer possible, or because biodiversity has meant that the animals and the fish and so on that they hunt have gone extinct. More likely they will have to leave though, because the agriculture that they work in or that they that supports their livelihoods has been destroyed as a result of rising sea levels, as seawater enters freshwater sources, or floods, and more frequently low-lying land, and crops can't grow, and so on. And those people will flee. They will, by and large, flee not abroad, as the racist media and so on like to say. Those people will flee to places in their own country or in neighbouring countries where they will try to find livelihoods, they'll find work, and so on. And they will do so in vast numbers. In 2015, the figures are that 8.3 million people fled their homes just because of flooding. 6.3 million people left because of storms, and 87,000 people globally fled because of wildfires. Now, many of those people fled temporarily. Their homes weren't permanently destroyed. They could come back after a period of weeks, months, or maybe years. But increasingly, as the climate crisis gets worse, there will be permanent destruction, and refugees will be permanently forced to leave. In 2018, just the most recent figures available, 16.1 million people were displaced due to extreme weather. And the predictions about how that will go in the future are very varied. At the extreme, some studies and reports suggest that by the year 2050, 1 billion people will be displaced as a result of climate change, extreme weather, and so on. That's the extreme end. The more commonly said figure is 200 to 500 million. And part of the problem, and this I suppose is the main political point of this talk, is that there is not really yet an agreed methodology to discuss and understand the question of climate refugees from those institutions internationally that are most responsible for people who are displaced. There's a real lack of acknowledgement of climate change as what the experts call a push factor in terms of migration, something that forces people to leave home. In fact, the official UN definition of refugees is people who are forced to leave as a result of violence, of persecution, or of war. Persecution could be because of religious or minority or sexuality and so on. And climate change doesn't fit within that category. And so when they talk about pushes, the UN and all those institutions, all those international bodies, don't really acknowledge climate change as a fixed cause. What they tend to talk about in the delightful language of NGOism is nexus dynamics. Nexus dynamics are the fact that climate change causes things to happen that then cause other things to make people flee. So the crops fail and people get hungry, so they move somewhere where they can eat. Well, those people are classed as moving as a result of hunger, not as a result of climate change. Or you can imagine a scenario where climate change causes two countries to go to war over access to water, but then those refugees would be acknowledged as having moved because of war not really because of the wider question of climate change. And I think this fits very much with what Extinction Rebellion, what Kyle has said, because actually the lack of acknowledgement of climate change as a driver of refugees and things helps undermine our understanding of what's actually going on in the world. I should say that in the same report where they refer to nexus dynamics, the United Nations say that what they lack is data and knowledge about what's happening on the ground. I think, frankly, if you haven't got the data and the knowledge now, you're the global institution responsible for refugees. You really need to start to do that. Back in December of 28, the UN General Council adopted the Global Compact on refugees, where they did acknowledge that, quote, climate and environmental degradation increasingly interact with drivers of refugee movements. Well, frankly, I think that's not enough of an example of an acknowledgement of the problem, and it will not help in the coming years as the situation worsens environmentally. The second thing I just wanted to say is that climate change doesn't impact upon communities and populations equally. It disproportionately affects the poor, it disproportionately affects black communities, it disproportionately affects minority communities within society. So, for instance, studies show over a whole range of natural disasters in various parts of the world, both the developed and the developing world, that if you're female, you're 14 more times more likely to become a victim in a natural disaster than if you're male. And sometimes, and I think we saw in that film there, the portrayal of those people who flee a climate disaster or suffer from natural disaster is often seen as only being in the developing world. It used to be, when I was a younger environmental activist, it was always Bangladesh that people talked about. Bangladesh was going to be flooded or submerged or would suffer repeatedly from extreme weather. But actually it's true of every nation in the world, and even the developed and the rich nations suffer as well. So, for instance, 1 million people in the United States were forced to flee their homes as a result of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and its impact upon New Orleans. Interestingly,